Almost nothing in American history is as misunderstood as the Great Depression. Here to debunk 7 all too prevalent myths about it, Learn Liberty welcomes back.
I'm Anthony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and co-host of the weekly podcast Words and Numbers.
Myth number 1. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of October 1929.
This is a myth that's repeated constantly in the history books. I think people are grasping to look for something. So they say, well, the stock market crash of October 1929, that must be it. In fact, if we look back at the National Bureau of Economic Research data, it turns out that the recession that ended up being the Great Depression started in August, 2 months earlier. You can see the economic downturn occurring. So the crash of 1929 was more a symptom rather than a cause of the recession that would become a Great Depression. One of the interesting things that was going on here is that prior to the crash, going back perhaps 4 or 5 years, the Federal Reserve was massively increasing the money supply. And while massively increasing the money supply, you would expect to see lots of inflation. That's the way these things normally work. And yet there wasn't any. Year after year, the Fed's increasing the money supply, no inflation, no inflation. What was happening is that this increase in the money supply was creating a bubble in the stock market. We weren't seeing prices of goods and services rise. Instead, we were seeing prices of stocks and financial instruments rise. That's scarily very similar to what was going on in this country leading up to COVID. So this bubble is simply waiting for an event to burst it. And one of the events that burst it was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, a sequence of tariffs that increase the cost of imported goods by up to 50%. And when I say increase the cost of imported goods, I mean increase the cost of like 20,000 imported goods by up to 50%. And you can see this as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs make their way through Congress. You can see the stock market reacting. In May of 1929, Smoot-Hawley passes the House of Representatives. The stock market drops 8%. And then it goes on, it makes its way through the Senate, but the Senate adds a whole bunch of other goods to the list of tariffs. 3 days later was Black Tuesday, the event that history books point to when they say this was the start of the Great Depression. I think in a lot of ways, what had happened here with the stock market crash is it was a combination of the Federal Reserve pumping up the money supply, that money supply making its way into stock markets, creating a bubble, and then the bubble being burst by this sequence of unprecedented tariffs. What happened in 1929 is the Fed massively increased the money supply by about as much, coincidentally, as the Fed has increased the money supply leading up to 2020. Here's the big difference. In 1929, the Fed panicked and it started decreasing the money supply. And that caused all sorts of problems because now all of a sudden people don't have access to the money that they need to transact business. There's a good analogy here. Think of money to an economy as oil is to an engine. The oil doesn't make the engine go, rather it lubricates the parts that make the engine go. Without the oil, the parts can't move without a lot of friction, and the friction causes a reduction of power. Eventually, the engine blows up if you don't have enough oil in there. So too in an economy. The money reduces the friction of transacting business. And in reducing the friction of transacting business, it makes it easier for employers to hire workers, for workers to buy things with their paychecks, to provide profit to employers, and the whole system moves along quite nicely. The Federal Reserve, in response to the stock market crash, massively contracted the money supply. That's something that the Federal Reserve is not doing today. Now, it is contracting the money supply to an extent, but not nearly to the extent that the Federal Reserve did back in 1929.